All right, so Jonathan Majors' trial ends up getting pushed back yet again. And my friends, you left me a bunch of comments saying you wanted to hear my take on it. So here it is. And, I think this process has to have been so insanely frustrating for Jonathan Majors. And before we get into it, I've got a question for you. Do me a favor and leave me a comment below. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? All right. So yes or no. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? And if you're feeling bold and you really want to contribute, right, let me know what it is that you got accused of. And, if the truth ever ended up coming out to light, because, it really makes you angry, upset, frustrated to be accused of something you didn't do. Right. And if you think about it, lies can have such a crazy impact on your life. Let's take it in the work context, right? If somebody says a lie that gets you in trouble with your bosses, you could end up, getting fired, right? You could get fired because someone accused you of having done something that you didn't do. Maybe you end up getting dumped because somebody was bitter and hated on your relationship, hated on you, told her that you were cheating and you weren't, and you end up getting dumped over it. We've heard of family fallouts that can last decades or even forever. Maybe someone's accused of taking money out of the family business or something like that. And it turns out that it was somebody else who did it, or it was an accounting error, right? But we know that false allegations and accusations can be majorly impactful on our lives. But the thing that's different between these examples that I mentioned and Jonathan Majors' case is that these things don't usually happen in the public eye. On the contrary, for Jonathan Majors, his business is out in the open for everyone to see. And, from his perspective, he's been publicly accused of something that he did not do. And you have to think about just the reputational harm that this man has suffered. I mean, his brand is forever tarnished. This is going to follow him in his career forever. And regardless of what happens in this case. And, again, I've been, on this kick that this case should eventually be dismissed. And I really hope that that's what happens based on, what I know. But regardless of what happens in this case, he has to deal with the stigma of having been charged with the crime and having been essentially dragged through the criminal justice system. And, there already have been, and there will be significant financial consequences that he's going to continue to suffer as a result of these allegations. And, aside from the career issues and the financial issues, there's just principle, right? Because Jonathan Majors is getting accused of having committed a crime when his position is that he's the victim, right? So, we talked about in a couple of videos ago on this topic how society just does not support male domestic violence victims. Male domestic violence victims do not get taken seriously, right? Even in some situations, you can get clowned for being a male domestic violence victim, or it's written off as, oh, that's just, you knew what you were getting into when you got into a relationship with that crazy woman, or however it ends up getting downplayed. These stereotypes affect these type of cases. And, the other dynamic of him just being, a big, strong dude. And I take it, I haven't seen any pictures of Grace Jabari, but I take it she's significantly smaller than Jonathan Majors, right? And you guys saw Creed, or at least you saw the clips, right? He doesn't look like a stereotypical victim of domestic violence, but, he was. And unfortunately, the police just didn't take him seriously initially. Remember, Jonathan Majors was the one who actually called 911. And the DA has charged this case, right? So they filed charges against Jonathan Majors. And not only that, but they've apparently made efforts to suppress the fact that Majors was the victim here. And so they just don't seem to be interested at all in seeking true justice as this case continues to drag on. And, again, I mean, there's just so much controversy surrounding this young man's name that he'll never be able to shake. And I just really think it's truly shameful. In the last video, we talked about, how the defense had requested a continuance. Basically, they were saying, yes, the DA is answering that they're ready for trial, but this case is not ready for trial. There's still outstanding discovery issues, and those are some of the issues that we're going to dive into in this video. And since the defense had requested that continuance, the defense has filed a motion to dismiss. And the really cool thing is that the motion, was made public, and, we get an opportunity to see the arguments raised in the motion. And again, this is something that, you normally wouldn't get a chance to see, but you get an opportunity to see a case play out like this and see some of the legal arguments that end up getting made that oftentimes, do not end up in the public eye. And I think that's what is special about this situation. But if you saw the motion, if you had a chance to read it, I think the defense opened the introduction to the motion strong. As a defense attorney, I just really love seeing passionate lawyering. I love seeing lawyers advocating hard for their clients. It's almost like, athletes love seeing other athletes. You draw inspiration, right? You draw inspiration from seeing other athletes. It motivates you to be better. You just want to see, for the love of the game, people going all out on the field, on the court, whatever it is, in the pool. And in this situation, seeing this motion, hey, I'm loving seeing them raise all these issues. On the flip side, it's frustrating that we're even here in this situation. But nonetheless, the defense opens basically by saying the people. And when you see the people, they mean the people of the state of New York. And so that's synonymous with the DA. So the DA is the people. And they say the people have had incontrovertible evidence that, one, Jonathan Majors is innocent of these charges. 2, Grace Jabari was not injured by him at all. And 3, Jonathan Majors is the real victim here. And on top of that, that NYPD, so the police, had found that there was probable cause to arrest Jabari for the crimes she committed. And, essentially what they're saying in the end is that the DA's failure to disclose certain information, as per their obligations, their statutory and ethical obligations, has essentially resulted in the denial of a speedy trial for Jonathan Majors. And, right in the introduction, they lay out the racial element. And they say, rather than dismiss false charges against an innocent black man, the people instead have willfully withheld evidence of his innocence. They've buried evidence proving that his white accuser is lying, and interfered with the police's attempts to investigate and arrest Mrs. Jabari. And, here's the deal. A lot of people get uncomfortable. They get upset. They get annoyed. And we see this more and more now that we have social media and we get to see how people really feel about certain issues, right? When these race issues come up, when racism comes up, I always find it fascinating how some people seem to get upset about folks complaining about racial injustice, but apparently have no problem at all with the racial injustice itself, right? The other thing is, on the topic of these complaints, when they come up, black people didn't create this situation. We just happen to live in it. And historically, the justice system has not exactly been friendly to black people in America. And so when these things pop up, it's hard to put it past the police and the DA to do shady stuff. And it's like, don't get at me. What's the line? I was given this world. I didn't make it. Right. So when we speak out on these things, the pushback, generally speaking, is uncalled for. But nonetheless, the DA essentially, from the defense's perspective, failed to meet their obligation to turn over exculpatory evidence. And so you may have heard of the term Brady material. And, essentially Brady stands for the shortened version of a Supreme Court case from 1963, and that was Brady versus Maryland. And in that case, it essentially dealt with the issue of prosecutors not turning over certain evidence. And ultimately, the Supreme Court held that it is a violation of a person's due process rights. So their constitutional rights is a violation for them not to turn over certain evidence. And so under Brady, a prosecutor has to turn over exculpatory evidence. What's exculpatory evidence? It's evidence that tends to exonerate the person who's charged with a crime, or, evidence that points to their innocence. And so the DA or a prosecutor has to turn over exculpatory evidence. They also have to turn over impeaching information. And this is, if the DA has someone that they plan to call as a witness and there's any information that would call into question that person's credibility, then they have to turn that over as well. If the DA plans to call a witness and there's some sort of information floating out there that would call into question that witness's credibility, that information has to be turned over to the defense so they have an opportunity to cross-examine this person on that issue. The DA also has to turn over any information or evidence that's considered material to the guilt or innocence of the person charged. So, the defense needs to know if there's information that clearly demonstrates that your client is guilty or that your client did what he's being charged with, then, you should be able to see that and then be able to review that with your client so they can make an informed decision as to what they should do in light of that evidence. On the flip side, if there's something obviously that points to your client's innocence, then you have a right under Brady to see that information, right? Any information that's pointing to your client's innocence, you have a right to see. And so if a prosecutor violates Brady, right? In other words, if they fail to turn over information that's required to be disclosed under Brady, even if they were acting in good faith, right? So it doesn't have to be shady or nefarious or purposeful, but if they did not turn over material exculpatory evidence, then this would, if the case were to have gone to trial, this would require, or it would be grounds for a new trial. So that's Brady. And that's one of the cases that's cited in this motion. That's why we're breaking this down, because, they're going to say that the DA failed to turn over Brady material. But then there's a second case that they talk about. That's another major case on the topic of disclosures by prosecutors, and that's under Giglio. So Giglio is another United States Supreme Court case, and this is from 1972, and it says that A prosecutor has to disclose when they've promised a witness that they're not going to prosecute them if they testify. Right. And you can just see out the gate why this is necessary to have in place. Right. And if they fail to do so, then this is also a due process violation and would be grounds for a new trial. Right. And that almost goes without saying. Right. If the DA has someone they're calling as a witness and they've said, hey, if you help us out, you testify on our behalf, then we're not going to prosecute you for this other crime, then the defense absolutely has a right to know that. Right. And the jury should be made aware of that. Why? Because that person has all the incentive in the world, right, to say whatever the DA wants them to say, because at the end of the day, they're getting some sort of benefit, whether that's they're not going to be prosecuted, right? They're going to get a better deal, something along those lines. That's something that the defense has a right to know. And ultimately, these rules are put in place to essentially keep things fair. Right? The police and prosecutors hold a lot of power. When we have these cases requiring prosecutors to turn this over, it's to make sure that the system is fair, or as fair as it can possibly be. And this is what I love about, looking at these cases, right? Seeing this motion, looking at these cases and getting that refresher on the importance of constitutional rights and the importance of advocating for someone's rights, because in what is called the adversarial system, you have a defense attorney, you have a DA, we're battling against each other. I had a professor in law school that used to say litigation is war. She said litigation is war. It's combat. And it really is a battle. You have two lawyers going at each other on behalf of their respective, people that they represent, right? The DA representing the people of the state and the defense attorney representing their client. There's an imbalance of power. There's an imbalance of resources. The government has its infinite resources and power. And if a trial is ultimately supposed to be a search for the truth, which it is, then what they said in Brady is that Brady basically protects the government's unique interest in a criminal prosecution, not to win a case, not to win, but to ensure that justice shall be done. And again, this is where a person's ambitions, somebody seeking to make a career for themselves, you're prosecuting Jonathan Majors, a big time actor, celebrity. There's going to be some career clout that comes along with having secured the conviction of Jonathan Majors, if that's what ends up being the situation. I don't think that should happen and probably won't. But again, there is, this thing where this DA has a desire to win this case, right? And it can be lost on certain prosecutors who can get emotionally and personally invested in a case to be seeking a win instead of going after justice. So when the DA fails to turn over the evidence pursuant to his Brady obligations, then the government's case ends up being much stronger and the defense case much weaker than the full facts would have suggested, right? If there's evidence that clearly shows that your client is innocent and the DA fails to disclose it, then that's going to make their case stronger than if they would have disclosed it, right? And so what they say is that by guarding against such an abuse of state power, Brady disclosure serves to ensure that a miscarriage of justice does not occur. Again, we're seeking the truth. We're seeking fundamental fairness. And so I think it's really important to have these cases, as a backdrop, for you guys, you're not looking at these type of cases every day or don't have this familiarity. For a criminal defense attorney, there's no need to, break these things down because you're just dealing with this all the time in terms of, Brady and Giglio. But, I think it's good for you guys to understand, what these cases stand for, what they mean, and how they play out in the real world. We learned in this motion, this is where we finally got a true understanding of what these pieces of evidence were that essentially support why the defense has been so adamant that Jonathan Majors is innocent. So you recall that there's an allegation that Majors essentially grabbed and twisted Jabari's finger, causing her injury, right? And, if Jonathan Majors had in fact grabbed her hand or grabbed her finger and twisted it, right? Twisted it, bended it, whatever. I said bended it, twisted it, bent it, causing a fracture. And that was not the result of acting in self-defense, then yes, that would be some sort of battery, right? And essentially that's what the DA wants to, if this case goes in front of a jury, they want to have a jury believe that that's what Majors did, that he grabbed her hand, he grabbed her finger, and he twisted it, right? And that's what caused her fracture. You simply cannot just take the DA's position at face value. You can't just believe what they're putting forth just because, they represent the people of the state of California or because they're the government, right? Remember, at the end of the day, the DA was not there. They weren't there. The police weren't there either. The only two people who really know what happened and what and whether Majors did this or not ultimately are Majors and Jabari. This is why objective evidence is helpful. And so we learned in this motion that Dr. William Chang was the doctor who treated Ms. Jabari for the injuries to her hand. And generally speaking, I mean, if you have injuries that are serious enough for someone to have to go to the hospital and get treatment, then usually those medical records will end up being part of the discovery, right? Under Brady, you'd have a right to that information because generally, I mean, that's either going to point to a person's guilt, right? If there's some sort of great bodily injury allegation, then usually the medical records are going to support that. Or, if there's some sort of entry in the records that points to the patient indicated that, she fell versus being hit. That's going to be information that the defense wants and needs to have as part of their information. Because if the DA is arguing that the injury happened one way and the medical records indicate that they happened another way, then, that's going to be Brady material. I found it interesting that the DA took so long to produce these medical records. Majors was arrested on March 25th. And the DA did not disclose these medical records until August 9th. And that's around 4.5 months later, right? I imagine it didn't take them that long to get these records. But Dr. Chang gave his expert opinion. And what he said was that, hey, the finger fracture that she ended up sustaining, that would usually come from either hitting an object, right? So you could, maybe punch a wall, sometimes people get upset, you hit an object, or from falling, right? So you could fall, you could trip and fall, land on your finger wrong and cause this type of injury. What he said is that it was possible, but uncommon. So possible, but uncommon that the fracture could have come from pulling, grabbing, or twisting, as the DA alleges. And this is very important because, number one, the doctor is an objective third party, right? He has no dog in this fight. He has no reason to lean one way or another. He's like, hey, I treated this injury. This is what my thoughts are in terms of what may have caused this. He can't say definitively, right? But he's able to give the opinion. And so what is important about his opinion here is that it establishes that it's much less likely that Majors caused this injury in the way that the DA is alleging. Because remember, the DA and Majors are not on equal ground in terms of what has to be proved. Jonathan Majors doesn't have to prove anything at all. The DA has to prove Majors' guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So they have to prove, if they're saying, hey, Majors grabbed her finger and twisted it and that's what caused her fracture, they have to be able to prove that. Presumably that would be via her testimony if she were going to say that. But as we'll see, there's other evidence that's going to support the conclusion that Majors didn't do this. But it's really important that the doctor, who was the treating physician, had indicated that he doesn't believe that that's how that ended up going down. With the DA having this piece of evidence that's clearly not good for their case, why did they take so long to turn this over? You got to remember that the DA, ultimately they have to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Majors doesn't have to prove anything. If you have a record from a doctor calling into question whether this injury was caused in the way that the DA is alleging, then that might be why they took so long to turn this piece of evidence over. The next thing that I found to be interesting was that there was a friend of Grace Jabari who said that she spoke to Miss Jabari on the phone, and Jabari admitted that, hey, I had gotten violent with Majors. So she said she got violent with Majors, not the other way around. She got violent with him, and she didn't know how she hurt her finger. She didn't know. So she didn't say, oh, Jonathan grabbed my, hand violently and he twisted my finger and he's the one that hurt it. She said she didn't know how she hurt her finger. Another crucial piece of information was video just minutes after this altercation, which showed that, Jabari wasn't harmed at all. She showed no signs of being injured. There's a point where she's talking about texts from, other women on Major's phone, which apparently is the reason why this whole thing popped off. But she didn't refer to any sort of physical abuse on the part of Majors at all. Because again, Major's position is that it never happened. There's also the nightclub video footage that shows Jabari, she's dancing and, she's using her hand. They have her, twirling around on the dance floor, being grabbed by the hand. If you have a fractured finger, you're not going to be able to do this, right? And so the idea is that this injury happened afterwards, right? Majors didn't cause this injury and it ended up having afterwards. She doesn't know, probably she fell down, right? After her time at the club, drunk, high, she fell, and that's how she caused this injury, or that's how this injury happened. And so when you look at all this information, along with the doctor's opinion, again, that it's possible, right? But uncommon that you would have an injury like this from grabbing and twisting, then that should be enough information for you to be convinced that this just did not happen in the way that it was originally reported. But again, this is evidence that the DA sat on for 4.5 months, knowing that Majors was exercising his right to a speedy trial. So the DA also delayed 5 months. They waited 5 months to disclose that NYPD had determined that there was probable cause to arrest Jabari for the crimes that she committed against Majors. And again, we talked about, just how rare it is for a guy to be arrested for domestic violence, but then turn around and go to the police, right, and file a report against your girl or against your ex. But we know that that's what Majors did. They went on the offensive, and ultimately the NYPD had determined, hey, there is probable cause to arrest Jabari. And the defense indicated, hey, we had to find out in the news. Like, the DA didn't tell us. We had to find out about this via the news. I think that's absolutely absurd. Why are you sitting on this information? Like, why are you not turning over this material? Again, if there's any material information tending to prove a person's innocence, you have to turn that over. And clearly, if you have a domestic violence case And there is evidence, right? There's evidence that the person who's been named as the victim, if there's evidence that they were actually the aggressor, then that's absolutely information that must be turned over to the defense. And this is absolutely something the DA should have either, picked up the phone and called, send a text, send an email, send some sort of notice, say, we've charged your client with domestic violence, but this information came up. It looks like, obviously, that your client went to NYPD, filed a report. It looks like they have determined that there's probable cause. I mean, that's a simple issue to reach out and say, right? But not only did the DA delay in disclosing the probable cause finding, but, the defense states that the DA actually made efforts in urging the police to not investigate or charge Mrs. Jabari. They didn't provide any information about these efforts to the defense. And the DA is obligated. They have to disclose this involvement in the NYPD investigation, right? Into Jabari's crimes. That's something that the defense has a right to know. Hey, we communicated with NYPD telling them don't move forward with this. That's something that the defense should be made aware of. It is crazy. It's shady for them to sort of backdoor this situation. They've filed charges against Majors, alleging that Jabari is a victim. Majors goes to the police, accuses her of domestic violence. They, on some level, find the accusations to be credible in that they reached the conclusion that there is probable cause for her arrest. And then the DA turns around and is like, nah, shut down that investigation. Or we're not trying to charge her. That's, man, it just really is upsetting to sit here and read that this is what's going on in this. Some of you already knew that the driver of the vehicle that Majors and Jabari were in, they had ended up giving a statement. He said that Jabari was the obvious aggressor, right? So he would have been in a position to see what was going on through his rear view mirror. And he said it was Jabari, not Majors, that was the aggressor in this situation. Apparently that just hasn't really meant anything to the DA. In the motion, there was a whole list. I think there was like 7 other items that the DA still had not yet provided, but they were claiming, right? They were claiming, hey, we're ready for trial, Your Honor. They filed a certificate of compliance indicating that they had already, met their disclosure obligations. You're signing this document and filing with the court saying, yep, hey, we've met all of our disclosure obligations. We're good to go. We're ready for trial. And yet there are major pieces of information that you still haven't disclosed. And, the crazy thing is that this is, this is a misdemeanor case, right? We're not talking about felonies. And since it's a misdemeanor case, Jonathan Majors had a right or has a right to have his trial within 90 days. All right. And ultimately, the defense basically argues that the DA's numerous egregious violations have essentially violated his right to a speedy trial. And so on that basis, they're arguing this case has to be dismissed. And if you read the motion, you might have had some questions about, how the days were calculated. They make references to days being chargeable to the people. Essentially, there's a time clock that's ticking every day. Unless a person waives their right to a speedy trial, right? Unless they enter a time waiver, waiving their right to a speedy trial, then that trial has to happen within the 90 days. But there are certain events that happen that, quote unquote, stop the clock. And that's what they're talking about when you see these references to these numbers of days. They're talking about whether there was a stoppage to the clock or where the clock should have resumed counting up to those 90 days. The whole discussion has been about the shady tactics the DA has pulled in this case. But, there are two sides to every story. And when you file a motion, the other side is always going to have the opportunity to respond. And the DA does have the opportunity to respond. And I anticipate that they will, to these positions that have been raised by the defense. But I'll tell you, this looks bad. It just really looks bad on the part of the DA's office. They are really displaying some serious violations in the public eye. But ultimately, the DA they'll have until October 6th. That's when they have to file their opposition to the motion. And then the defense can reply to their opposition by October 13th. And then there's going to be a hearing, right? So you file your motion, then there's opposition, then there's an optional reply. And then on the 25th will be the hearing. So that's when the judge will decide on the motion. And, what you have to understand and take into consideration is, this is a misdemeanor domestic violence charge. These happen every single day of the week. People are getting arrested for misdemeanor domestic violence. It's not the crime of the century, right? And, essentially, if Jonathan Majors had pled guilty, he wouldn't be doing any jail time. He might be on probation, might have to take a class, maybe some community service and a fine. So, it's not, especially he has no criminal history. This is not a serious case per se. And so there's nothing that's, particularly special about this case besides the fact that we're dealing with a famous actor. But I think that's what makes this all the more important, because we're seeing some, allegations of some serious statutory and ethical violations that are being committed by this DA's office. And unfortunately, these are the types of things that happen so often to people who don't have resources, right? At the end of the day, if Jonathan Majors was not a rich and famous actor, he would not have the resources to have his counsel look so deeply into all of these issues and prepare this motion and cite these egregious violations. And, ultimately he might just be encouraged to take a deal because, oh, look, well, she went to the hospital and she had you fractured her finger, or at least that's what she's going to say to a jury. And what are you going to do? The evidence is so strong against you, and be encouraged to take a deal. And I think that's just one of the most tragic parts of this situation, because again, something like this, a motion to dismiss filed in a random misdemeanor domestic violence case, would never see, the light of day in terms of being on this national stage that this case is on, because there's not, generally speaking, there's not famous people involved in these cases. And so, ultimately we'll see how the judge rules. If they side with the defense, if the judge sides with the defense and finds that the DA violated Majors' speedy trial rights, then, essentially the case should be dismissed. But if the judge denies the motion, then I imagine at that point we'll probably get a set trial date. But again, however this motion is ruled upon, I still believe that this case should ultimately be dismissed. In fact, I thought that the case should be dismissed just based on the facts, right? The defense is raising legal issues as to why this case should be dismissed. But I'm saying just based on the facts alone, let alone any legal issues, this case should be dismissed. And now, after seeing the motion, I feel even more strongly that the case should be dismissed based on the facts. But, we'll see. We'll see what happens with the judge's ruling. And from there, if this case survives the motion and continues forward, whether, the case ends up being set for trial, and whether Jabari is going to come back and show up, potentially subjecting herself to getting arrested. I still think that she's not going to want to come back, especially now seeing, some of this evidence. You got a chance to see that pillowcase with the blood on it. Obviously, Jonathan Major's position was that he was attacked by Jabari. Yeah, I just think at the end of the day, you know, she doesn't really have any incentive to come back. You know, at the end of the day, especially the way this thing seems to be playing out, she's the one that caused this issue. And if she's potentially subject to being arrested, she doesn't really have any incentive to come back. And so I think the DA is ultimately going to dismiss this case. But let me know if you have any questions below. Your questions are what led to this video. I hope you got something out of it. I appreciate the feedback. I want to thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Peace.